For the first time ever, a camera caught Bigfoot doing something nobody has ever seen. A wildlife filmmaker managed to capture the undoubted proof of his existence, and what he shot is the most shocking thing Bigfoot has done in history. Thomas Bannister had spent 20 years pointing cameras at animals in the Pacific Northwest forests. He had filmed bear behavior in the Cascades, followed wolfpack dynamics across 3 winters in Idaho, and spent 3 consecutive winters embedded with a Roosevelt elk herd in the Olympic Peninsula. He understood large animal behavior the way someone understands anything they have spent 2 decades watching closely, not from textbooks, but from the accumulated weight of having seen what was normal so many times that the first moment something was not normal registered before he could have explained why. He knew what hunting looked like. He knew what instinct looked like. What he watched on his editing screen on November 8, 2016, was neither of those things. It was something he did not have a word for yet. And the word he eventually settled on, after a year of working through what the footage meant, was the reason he made a decision at the end of that year that most people in his field thought was wrong. He withheld evidence, deliberately. He had a second clip, captured almost a year after the first, and he chose not to release it, not because he doubted what it showed, but because of what a year of studying the first clip had taught him about what was living in that forest. And the reasoning behind that decision is the part of this story that does not resolve cleanly. Thomas had arrived at the Hoh River area of Olympic National Park in late October 2016, following Roosevelt elk through the early stages of their winter migration. The Hoh rainforest was old-growth Pacific Northwest at its most dense, Douglas fir and Sitka spruce with canopies so thick that midday light barely touched the ground. The river flats pulled elk down from the ridges, and the game trails were ancient, worn so deep into the soil by generations of the same animals using the same routes for so many years that the paths looked more like trenches than trails. Thomas had been in this area before. He knew the river crossings. He knew the game trails. He knew exactly which crossing to put a camera on to get footage worth driving all the way from Seattle 4. He bolted a high-resolution motion-activated unit 12 feet up a Douglas fir on November 1st, angled toward a shallow crossing point where fresh elk tracks showed the animals had been coming through regularly. The camera could record in clear detail even in near darkness, and its trigger was fast enough to catch almost any animal that moved through the frame. Thomas checked the angle, made sure the battery was full, and drove back to his camp near the park entrance. He planned to come back in 5 days, pull the memory card, see what he had, and reposition the camera if he needed to. He pulled the card on November 8th. He was expecting elk footage. The clip from 6:44 a.m. on November 3rd opened on a normal dawn scene. Soft gray light coming through the trees, the river moving slow and dark, a section of muddy bank where the water got shallow enough to cross without much trouble. The motion trigger had caught a young black-tailed deer stepping into the shot from the left side of the frame, picking its way carefully down the bank toward the water with the nervous start and stop walk of an animal that was paying attention to its surroundings but had not picked up on anything specific to be scared of yet. The deer looked like it weighed around 90 pounds, young, still a little unsure of itself, ears swiveling to catch any sound, nose testing the cool morning air. It reached the edge of the water and put its head down to drink. The camera was still running when the big cedar tree on the right side of the frame suddenly had something behind it that had not been there a moment before. Bigfoot stepped out from behind the trunk of a massive old-growth cedar about 40 feet from the deer and placed itself with a kind of slow, deliberate purpose that was completely unlike anything Thomas had seen in 20 years of wildlife filming. It did not wander in. It did not step through. It placed itself. One moment the cedar was just a cedar. The next moment something was using it as a hide, and the way it tucked in behind the trunk, the exact angle it picked to stay out of the deer's sightline, the instant total stillness it dropped into the moment it was in position. All of it communicated one thing without any ambiguity at all. This was a plan, already in progress before the camera caught it. Bigfoot was at least 8 feet tall. Its hair was dark brown with lighter coloring across the face and chest, and the individual hairs were clearly visible in the morning light, moving slightly in the river breeze the way real hair moves. the way actual individual strands shift at different speeds when the wind catches them, darker along the spine and thicker on the arms where the coat was more matted. Its shoulders were wider than anything Thomas had ever pointed a camera at. Its arms, visible where they gripped the bark of the cedar, hung past its knees. Its hands, spread out flat against the tree trunk, covered what Thomas would later estimate at nearly 3 feet of bark, and then nothing moved, not once. The deer kept drinking, head down, completely unaware. Bigfoot had not made a sound. The position it had chosen put it in the cedar shadow and broke up its outline enough that from the deer's direction it was almost invisible. And that was not an accident. To choose that specific position required knowing in advance where the deer would be looking. The deer had been completely outthought. 17 seconds passed. The camera recorded every one of them. During those 17 seconds, Bigfoot didn't move a single time. No weight shifts, no muscle twitches, none of the small involuntary movements that every large animal makes simply from being alive. Its head stayed locked on the deer, tracking without a single adjustment. Whatever was happening in Bigfoot's mind, the body was under a level of voluntary control that had no equivalent in any predator Thomas had ever studied. He would later say the stillness was the most disturbing part of the whole clip, not what came after it, but what it implied about what was going on before. Then it launched. That was the word Thomas used every single time he described what came next. Not ran, not charged, launched. From total stillness to full speed in what looked like a single movement. No building, no transition, no middle stage. One moment completely still behind the cedar. The next moment covering ground at a speed the camera's microphone recorded as heavy thumping impacts, each one barely a fraction of a second apart. Each one hitting like something very large and very fast was making contact with the earth. 40 feet in under 3 seconds. The deer's head came up at the second footfall, its legs loaded, its hindquarters dropped, its whole body gathered to run. The exact sequence of a prey animal that has just understood it needs to leave right now. The reaction was fast. Any predator that Forrest had, mountain lion, bear, wolf, would have watched the deer clear the gap. Bigfoot was already there before the deer's legs could fire. What happened at the moment of contact was the part of the footage that made every person who watched it go quiet. Bigfoot did not drive the deer to the ground, did not crash into it, did not do what any predator in that ecosystem would do, use body mass and impact to bring it down. Instead, in one motion, flowing directly out of the sprint, Bigfoot reached down with one arm and simply picked the deer up. One arm, one motion. A 90-pound animal in full panic, legs pumping against nothing, throwing its body weight in every direction, and Bigfoot absorbed all of it without breaking stride. The deer ended up tucked under Bigfoot's arm like a carried object, controlled and going nowhere, while Bigfoot crossed the remaining stretch of riverbank and hit the tree line at the same speed it had been running since the cedar. By the time it reached the trees, nothing about the way it moved suggested it was carrying anything at all, just the deer's legs sticking out, still kicking, and the sounds the deer was making, still audible on the camera's microphone until the forest took both of them. 31 seconds from Bigfoot's first appearance to the moment the trees closed behind it. The camera kept recording for 2 more minutes after that, showing nothing but the empty riverbank and the slow-moving water. The section of the bank where the deer had been drinking looked completely undisturbed. No blood, no tracks scattered in panic patterns, no fur or debris of the kind any other predator encounter leaves behind. The scene looked almost exactly the same as it had before any of it occurred, which was its own kind of disturbing because it meant this was practiced. A cleanup this complete, an exit this clean and fast, did not happen by accident the first time. And if it was not the first time, then this river crossing had a history that nobody had been present to document. The deer that had come to this water source over months and years before Thomas's camera arrived had come and gone from a crossing that was being hunted regularly, and no evidence of any of it had been left behind for anyone to find. Thomas watched the clip 7 times before he drove back to Seattle. He spent the first full day running every check he knew from 2 decades of documentary work. The hair moved differently on different parts of Bigfoot's body, the strands across its shoulders responding to the breeze differently than the thicker matted sections lower down its arms, exactly the way real hair of different lengths behaves in wind. Beneath the hair, the muscles of its shoulders and upper back were visibly working as it ran, in the same shifting, rolling pattern that any large running animal produces. During the stillness behind the cedar, Bigfoot's chest rose and fell with its breathing. He spent a long time on the hands. The grip on the cedar trunk was 5-fingered, each finger fully wrapped around the bark, with a span that no human hand came close to matching. The single-arm scoop that lifted a panicked 90-pound animal mid-sprint, one smooth downward motion, complete control, no visible exertion, no change in pace. Thomas had spent 20 years filming large animals. He understood enough about what bodies could and could not do to know that what he had just watched placed Bigfoot in a category of physical strength that nothing he had ever filmed belonged to. He ran the speed numbers multiple ways. The distance from the cedar to the deer was 40 feet, a measurement he had made himself on his last visit to the location. Bigfoot had covered that distance in under 3 seconds, starting from a complete standstill, maintaining that speed through the grab, and through carrying a struggling animal all the way to the forest edge. The numbers he kept arriving at were somewhere between 25 and 28 miles per hour. Bigfoot's estimated weight, based on body proportions, put it in the same class as a large male grizzly bear. A grizzly's top sprint is faster, but only over short distances and with nothing to carry. The combination of that speed, that weight, and that grip strength while managing a 90-pound struggling animal had no match in any wildlife data Thomas could find. But the speed, by the time he had finished analyzing the 17 seconds, was almost beside the point. He reached out to a wildlife biologist he had worked with before, someone who ran an independent research station near Ashford and had a reputation for careful, skeptical work. The biologist watched the footage, asked for a second copy, and called Thomas back the same evening. The call went on for 2 hours. What the biologist kept returning to was not the speed or the strength, it was the 17 seconds. Those 17 seconds had no match anywhere in the documented behavior of large North American predators. Not bears, not mountain lions, the most patient ambush hunters in the region. Nothing in their behavioral records showed what the footage showed. Deliberate selection of a specific piece of cover based on the prey's approach direction, holding that position through 2 alert responses without a single movement, and timing the launch to the exact moment of maximum exposure. That was not predatory instinct, that was a hunting strategy. The biologist said those words carefully. Not a behavior, not a reflex, not an instinct, a strategy. Then the biologist brought up the cedar tree itself, and this was the point in the analysis where the question shifted from what Bigfoot could do to what Bigfoot knew. That game trail was old. The path had been worn into the soil by deer and elk, using the same route to the same water source for so many generations that it looked carved. Any large animal spending regular time in that forest would have crossed that trail many times and would have seen deer and elk using it repeatedly. The cedar Bigfoot used for cover was the single best concealment position at that approach angle, the only piece of cover that worked from the direction the deer had come from. To have chosen it, Bigfoot had to have known in advance which direction the deer would come from. That was not something figured out in the moment. That was accumulated knowledge of a specific hunting ground, built through repeated experience in that specific territory, which meant this was not Bigfoot's first hunt at this crossing, which meant Bigfoot had been hunting this river crossing from that cedar using that game trail long before Thomas's camera arrived, long before Thomas had ever been in this forest. And the deer that had come to this water source over those months and years had no idea what was waiting for them because Bigfoot had never given them a reason to find out. The biologist flagged one more thing in a follow-up call 3 days later. The deer had actually paused twice on its approach, once at the tree line, again at about 15 feet from the bank, rotating its ears and lifting its nose, doing the careful scanning of an animal that has registered something vaguely wrong without being able to identify a specific threat. The deer had, on some level, sensed something was there, and Bigfoot had held perfectly frozen through both of those moments. Not a twitch, not a readjustment. Nothing that let the deer's alarm system lock on and confirm. The biologist said he had spent years studying predator-prey dynamics in Pacific Northwest forests and had never documented any large predator with the impulse control to hold position through 2 close-range alert responses. That level of control, he said, was not something animals had. It was something that thinking things had. Thomas reached out to a second expert, a video forensics specialist who ran a small independent lab outside of Olympia and had done authenticity work on documentary footage before. He sent the full video file with all of the camera's built-in data left intact, the compression information, the timestamps from the internal clock, the GPS location data written directly into the file. He asked for a complete analysis and deliberately did not tell the technician anything about what the footage showed. The technician came back 8 days later with a full report. It went through every technical indicator of digital manipulation that video forensics tools could detect. How compression artifacts behaved across the file, whether the timestamps matched up correctly, how motion blur worked at the edges of the moving subject, whether the lighting stayed consistent as Bigfoot moved from shadow into the early morning light near the river, whether shadow directions matched the actual sun position for that timestamp, and GPS location. The report found 0 indicators of manipulation. Everything was consistent with genuine footage captured by that camera model under those lighting conditions on that morning. The technician added a personal note at the end. If someone had faked the footage, they would have needed to do it at a level of technical skill beyond anything achievable with standard equipment, and would have needed to know the exact position of a hidden elk camera, the exact time a deer would approach that crossing, and the exact quality of the light that specific morning. The simpler explanation, the technician wrote, was that the footage was real. Thomas presented the clip at a closed cryptozoology conference in British Columbia in December 2016. He put together a presentation that included the raw clip, his own frame-by-frame breakdown, and both independent expert reports. He had decided going in that he was not going to try to push the audience toward any particular conclusion. No dramatic voiceover, no leading questions, no attempt to get ahead of what people were thinking while they watched. He showed the clip, shared the data, and let the 31 seconds do the work. The response was the kind of divided, tense silence that precedes serious argument, because everyone in that room understood what the hunting sequence meant. Not a large primate opportunistically finding food. An apex predator with a defined method, deep territorial knowledge, and physical capabilities that placed it above every other predator in the Olympic Peninsula. The researchers who had spent years building behavioral evidence for Bigfoot's existence understood right away what they were looking at. The skeptics focused on what was missing: no carcass, no hair, no castable prints. Footage alone had never been considered enough. But underneath both reactions was the question that the hunting sequence actually raised, the one that did not resolve into either category. Not whether the footage was real, not whether more evidence was needed. How long had something with that level of hunting intelligence been operating in that forest, using those specific crossings, making decisions based on that specific territorial knowledge? And how many other forests were there, with their own crossings and their own cedar trees, where the same thing had been happening without a single trail camera ever being in the right place at the right time? Thomas announced at the conference that he was going back to the Olympic Peninsula in the spring of 2017 with a small team and proper search equipment, with the goal of finding physical evidence at and around the site. He was not done with the Hoh River corridor. Whatever had been using that cedar as a regular hunting position had been doing it before his camera arrived, and he believed it was still doing it. The spring 2017 trip brought him back to the river crossing with a 3-person team and equipment that included sensors for detecting buried organic material and dogs trained to locate wildlife remains. They searched the area around the cedar for 4 full days, expanding outward in the direction Bigfoot had gone when it left the frame. They found disturbed vegetation in a pattern consistent with the exit path. They found 1 partial impression in soft ground near the river's edge, too weathered to cast, but large enough and correctly oriented to be consistent with a very large bipedal footprint. That was it. The forest had done what Pacific Northwest old growth does. 4 months of rain and heavy biological activity had broken down, and absorbed whatever evidence had been there. Nothing was left to recover. Thomas came back to Seattle with the spring findings and added them to the file he had been building since November. The partial imprint photographs, the mapped vegetation disturbance, the forensic lab report, the biologist's behavioral analysis, the speed and strength breakdown from his frame-by-frame work on the original footage. He compiled it into a single document and sent copies to the small group of researchers he trusted to handle it seriously. In September 2017, he returned again. He set cameras at 12 locations within a 2-mile radius, not to catch Bigfoot directly, because he had already understood that the original clip had only happened because the camera was there for elk. Whatever awareness Bigfoot had about human activity in its territory put it at a permanent advantage over any camera placed deliberately to find it. He went back to understand the territory, what Bigfoot used, how it moved through the forest over time. The cameras ran through fall and into early winter 2017. Several captured elk footage exactly as planned. One caught a black bear working a section of riverbank about half a mile north of the original location. 3 recorded nothing except the forest-changing light and weather across the recording window. One camera, set up on a ridge overlooking the river corridor about 3/4 of a mile southeast of the cedar tree, caught something on the evening of October 19th, 2017. Something large and upright, moving through the thick undergrowth at the top of the ridge with the steady, unhurried pace of an animal that was not startled and was not in any rush to get somewhere. It was in the frame for less than 4 seconds, and the low light had pushed the image quality down to the point where specific details were hard to make out. But the shape was the same. The silhouette, how wide the shoulders were, how long the arms were compared to the rest of the body height, the 2-legged stride, matched what Thomas had spent the better part of a year studying in careful detail from the November 2016 clip. Whatever had used that cedar tree as a hunting blind was still in that forest almost a year later, still moving through it, still unhurried, still invisible to every deliberately placed camera in a 2-mile grid, and only caught it all because one unit happened to be pointed at the right ridge at the right moment. Thomas added the clip to his file and made the hardest professional decision of his career. He chose not to release it, not because he doubted what it showed, because a year of working through the behavioral evidence in the original footage had brought him to a specific conclusion about what kind of intelligence was operating in the Hoh River corridor. And that conclusion made him genuinely uncomfortable with the idea of directing more human attention into the territory it was living in. The 31 seconds had started as a question about what Bigfoot was. By the end of 12 months, it had become a question about what happens when something that intelligent, that capable, that practiced in remaining invisible, what happens when the world finds out exactly where it is. The November 2016 footage showed something faster than every other animal in that forest, stronger than every other animal in that forest, patient enough to hold 17 seconds of perfect voluntary stillness while a prey animal closed the distance, strategic enough to have chosen its hide based on advanced knowledge of how that specific animal would approach that specific water source. It had taken a 90-pound deer in a single-arm grab at full sprint, disappeared into old-growth timber in 31 seconds, and left a scene so undisturbed that the river crossing looked exactly as it had before any of it occurred. That footage, 31 seconds on a November morning by the Hoh River, remained the most complete behavioral documentation of Bigfoot ever captured. Not because of what it showed about Bigfoot's size or appearance, because of what those 17 seconds of total stillness before the sprint revealed about what was happening behind its eyes. The speed was extraordinary, the strength was extraordinary, but the plan, the selection of that cedar at that angle, based on that knowledge of that trail, was what put this footage in a different category from every piece of Bigfoot evidence that had come before it. What Thomas Bannister's trail camera caught on November 3, 2016, was not a Bigfoot sighting. It was a predator operating inside a territory it understood completely, faster than everything else in that forest, stronger than everything else in that forest, invisible to every deliberately placed camera in a 2-mile search grid for the entire following year, and apparently aware enough of human activity in its range to have adjusted its behavior accordingly. The 31 seconds of footage had started as a question about what Bigfoot was. The year that followed turned it into a question Thomas eventually decided he was not willing to answer out loud. What would happen to that territory and to what was living in it if the rest of the world came to understand exactly what it was capable of? He had a second clip. He kept it to himself, and the Hoh River corridor kept going, old growth and rain and game trails worn deep into the earth. And somewhere in it, if the October 2017 footage meant what Thomas believed it meant, the cedar tree by the river crossing was still there and still being used, and the deer still had no idea. Thank you for watching. If you liked this video, check out this one.